It was a quiet afternoon at Inked and Unbreakable, a tattoo parlor nestled in a bustling corner of the city. The shop was nothing extraordinary from the outside, just a simple brick building with a neon sign that flickered occasionally. But to those who stepped inside, it felt like a different world. The scent of antiseptic and faint traces of ink hung in the air, mingling with the low hum of the buzzing tattoo needles. Walls lined with framed artwork told stories of love, loss, rebellion, and redemption. Each design was a masterpiece, created by hands that understood the language of skin and ink better than most could ever imagine. Behind the counter stood Maddox, the shop's owner. He was a quiet man, the kind of person you'd barely notice in a crowd. He didn't talk much, and when he did, his words were measured and precise, never more than necessary. Maddox preferred to let his work do the talking. And what a conversation it was! His tattoos had a life of their own. Each stroke seemed to breathe emotion, each color seemed to tell a secret. Maddox wasn't flashy or loud like some other artists in the industry. He didn't flaunt his skills or chase the spotlight. He simply did his work, day in and day out, perfecting the craft he had poured his soul into. He wore long-sleeved shirts that covered his own tattoos, giving him an air of mystery. Customers often wondered what kind of ink he had chosen for himself, but no one dared to ask. There was something about Maddox that felt different. It wasn't just his calm demeanor or the way he moved with quiet confidence. It was the way he carried himself, like someone who had seen too much, someone who had been through things others couldn't imagine. Beneath the surface, beneath the ink and the silence, Maddox had a secret. He wasn't always the tattoo artist people saw today. Before he opened Inked and Unbreakable, Maddox had lived a life no one in the shop could begin to guess. It was a life filled with shadows, a world of danger and decisions that had left permanent marks not just on his skin, but on his soul. It wasn't something he talked about. Not to his customers, not to his friends. That chapter of his life was closed, or so he thought. The afternoon sun streamed through the front windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Maddox was hunched over his workbench, carefully sketching out a design for a client. His hands moved with precision, each line deliberate. The buzz of a needle filled the room, blending with the faint hum of the old radio in the corner. The shop was quiet, just the way Maddox liked it. Most of the regulars had already come and gone for the day. The few remaining customers were either admiring the flash designs on the wall or waiting patiently for their turn in the chair. Maddox barely noticed them. When he worked, the world faded away. It was just him, the ink, and the story he was bringing to life on someone's skin. But the peace wouldn't last. The first sign of trouble came with the sound of engines. Deep, guttural roars echoed down the street, growing louder with each passing second. Maddox paused, his pen hovering over the sketchpad. He recognized the sound instantly: motorcycles. And not just any motorcycles. These were the heavy, growling machines that belonged to people who weren't just riding for fun. The roar grew deafening as the bikes came to a stop right outside the shop. Maddox didn't look up. Instead, he set his pen down slowly, his movements deliberate. He'd been here before, in a way. This wasn't the first time his quiet sanctuary had been interrupted by the kind of noise that signaled trouble. The door swung open with a loud clang, the tiny bell above it jangling wildly. 3 men stepped inside, their presence filling the room instantly. They wore leather jackets emblazoned with a logo that was hard to miss: a skull surrounded by flames. The logo wasn't just decoration. It was a symbol, a warning. The leader, a tall man with a scruffy beard and an air of arrogance, surveyed the room with a sneer. He spotted Maddox behind the counter and strode over, his boots thudding against the floor. His 2 companions followed closely, their eyes scanning the shop like they owned the place. "Nice little setup you got here," the leader said, his voice loud and grating. He slapped his hand on the counter, making the customer closest to him flinch. "We've heard about your work, old man. Let's see if you're as good as they say. Maddox looked up, his expression unreadable. He didn't respond, didn't rise to the challenge in the man's tone. Instead, he reached for his tools, his movements calm and methodical. The second biker, a wiry man with a tattoo snaking up his neck, smirked as he glanced at Maddox's sketchbook. "This your work? Looks like something a kid could doodle," he said, snorting. The third biker laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. Maddox didn't react. He'd heard worse, seen worse. He wasn't about to let their words get under his skin. But the tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. The other customers in the shop exchanged nervous glances, some quietly gathering their things and heading for the door. The leader leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. "You deaf, old man? I said we want ink. Quick and cheap. Got it?" Maddox's gaze met his for a brief moment, steady and unflinching. Then, without a word, he gestured to the chair. The leader smirked, clearly taking Maddox's silence as submission. He sat down, rolling up his sleeve to reveal a bare patch of skin on his forearm. The room fell silent as Maddox prepared his tools. The buzzing of the needle filled the air again, louder now, almost electric. Maddox's hands moved with practiced ease, his focus unshaken. The leader watched him, his smirk fading slightly as the tattoo began to take shape. There was something unsettling about the way Maddox worked. His movements were too precise, too deliberate. The leader couldn't quite put his finger on it, but a small, nagging feeling of unease began to creep into his mind. Outside, the motorcycles sat idle, their engines cooled but still menacing. Inside, the air was thick with unspoken tension. Maddox's quiet determination was a stark contrast to the bikers' loud bravado. What none of them knew was that the quiet man sitting across from them wasn't just any tattoo artist. Maddox had seen more danger, faced more threats, and walked away from more fights than these bikers could imagine. And though he didn't want trouble, trouble had a way of finding him. As the needle buzzed and the ink seeped into the biker's skin, Maddox couldn't help but think, they have no idea who they're dealing with. The tension in the air was like a coiled spring, tight and ready to snap. Maddox didn't say a word as he worked, his hands steady as ever. The leader of the bikers, who introduced himself with a cocky smirk as Razor, kept glancing at Maddox, trying to gauge his reaction, or rather, his lack of one. "You're pretty quiet, aren't you?" Razor sneered, breaking the silence. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" Maddox didn't look up. He had no intention of engaging with the man's bravado. Razor wasn't the first loudmouth to walk through the door, and he certainly wouldn't be the last. But there was something different about this group, something darker. The second biker, a wiry man with a crooked grin who went by Slim, chuckled and nudged the youngest of the trio, a burly guy nicknamed Tank. "Maybe he's scared of us," Slim said, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. "I mean, look at him. He doesn't look like much." Tank laughed, a low, guttural sound that made the remaining customers in the shop visibly uneasy. One of them, a young woman waiting for a consultation, quietly gathered her things and slipped out the door, the bell jingling faintly as it closed behind her. Maddox noticed, of course, but he didn't react. He simply continued his work, the needle buzzing as he etched an intricate design into Razor's skin. The design itself was something Razor had demanded on the spot, a flaming skull surrounded by barbed wire. It wasn't Maddox's usual style, he preferred creating tattoos with deeper meaning, art that told a story. But today wasn't about art. Today was about surviving the storm these bikers had brought with them. "You know," Razor said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "I've been to a lot of tattoo shops. Seen a lot of artists. Some are pretty damn impressive. But you're just boring." Slim laughed again, and Tank joined in, their voices echoing in the small shop. Maddox didn't flinch. He had been called worse. Still, something about Razor's tone grated on him. Maddox wasn't one to rise to provocation, but his patience was wearing thin. He kept his focus on the tattoo, his hands moving with practiced precision. As he worked, Maddox's mind wandered to the past, the life he had left behind. It had been years since he walked away, since he turned his back on the chaos and violence that had once defined him. Back then, he had been someone else entirely. Someone dangerous. But he had made a choice to change. To leave that life behind and start over. Inked and Unbreakable wasn't just a business to Maddox, it was his sanctuary, his way of creating something beautiful out of the ashes of his past. And yet, here he was, face to face with trouble once again. Trouble that had swaggered into his shop wearing leather jackets and smug grins. Razor winced slightly as the needle hit a sensitive spot, but he quickly masked it with a smirk. "Careful, old man," he said, his voice laced with mockery. "Don't screw it up, or I'll make sure this place doesn't stay open much longer." That got a reaction not from Maddox, but from one of the customers still sitting in the corner. An older man, probably in his 50s, shot Razor a disapproving look. But before he could say anything, Slim turned toward him with a menacing glare. "Got a problem, Grandpa?" Slim asked, his voice low and threatening. The older man quickly looked away, muttering something under his breath. Slim chuckled, clearly enjoying the display of intimidation. Maddox set his jaw, but he didn't say a word. He knew better than to escalate the situation. As he continued working, his eyes flicked to the bikers' tattoos. Each one told a story not just of their allegiance to the gang but of their history, their crimes, their triumphs and failures. Maddox recognized some of the symbols. He'd seen them before, years ago, in a life he didn't like to think about. The skull and flame logo on their jackets wasn't just for show. It belonged to a gang called the Iron Fang, a name that sent chills down the spines of anyone who had crossed their path. Maddox had heard the stories, the robberies, the fights, the lives ruined in their wake. The Iron Fang didn't just ride bikes, they left destruction wherever they went. And now they were here, in his shop. The shop bell jingled again, and a tall man in a crisp suit stepped inside. He was clearly out of place in the tattoo parlor, his polished shoes clicking against the floor as he walked. The man hesitated for a moment, taking in the scene, the bikers, the tension, the uneasy customers. "Can I help you?" Maddox asked, finally breaking his silence. The man glanced at Razor and his crew before turning his attention back to Maddox. "I'm just here for a consultation," he said, his voice steady but cautious. Maddox nodded toward the waiting area. "Take a seat. I'll be with you shortly." Razor snorted. "Looks like business is booming," he said, gesturing toward the nearly empty shop. "You should be thanking us for bringing some excitement to this place." The man in the suit said nothing, his expression unreadable. He sat down in the corner, opening a sleek leather portfolio and pretending to focus on its contents. But Maddox could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes darted toward the bikers every so often. Maddox returned to his work, his mind racing. Who was this man? And why did he seem just as out of place here as the bikers? The answer, Maddox suspected, would reveal itself soon enough. As Razor's tattoo neared completion, the bikers grew restless. Slim and Tank began pacing the shop, their boots thudding against the floor. One of them picked up a framed photo from the counter, a picture of Maddox with a younger man, both of them smiling. "Who's this?" Slim asked, holding up the photo. Maddox didn't look up. "None of your business." Slim smirked and set the photo back down, but not before leaving a greasy fingerprint on the glass. Maddox's hand tightened around the tattoo machine. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. The door slammed shut behind the bikers with a metallic clang, the sound reverberating through the quiet tattoo parlor. The smallest flicker of unease rippled across the faces of the remaining customers, but it was Maddox who remained as steady as stone. The leader, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a jagged scar running down his cheek, strolled to the counter like he owned the place. His leather jacket bore the unmistakable insignia of the Iron Fang Gang, a flaming skull with sharp fangs dripping blood. It wasn't just a logo, it was a warning. "Yo, old man," the leader barked again, louder this time, slapping the counter with a force that rattled the jar of ink bottles. His voice carried the kind of authority that came from years of intimidating people into submission. Maddox looked up from his station, his eyes meeting the leader's with a calm that was almost unsettling. He didn't flinch, he didn't blink. The room seemed to shrink as the two locked gazes, the air heavy with unspoken challenge. The leader smirked. He wasn't used to people holding their ground. "We've heard about you," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Maddox, the legendary tattoo artist. Let's see if you're as good as they say or if you're just a washed-up has-been." Behind him, the younger biker, a lanky guy with a mop of unkempt hair, leaned over the counter, his beady eyes scanning Maddox's sketchbook. He let out a high-pitched laugh. This is what people rave about." He jabbed a finger at one of the sketches, a detailed depiction of a phoenix rising from ashes. "My kid brother could do better with a box of crayons." The third biker, a massive man built like a tank, stood silently by the door, arms crossed over his chest. He didn't need to say anything, his sheer presence was enough to make anyone think twice about causing trouble. Maddox didn't respond to their taunts. He simply reached for his tools, his movements deliberate and measured. Without a word, he motioned to the leader, silently inviting him to take the chair. The leader's smirk widened. "Well, at least you know how to follow orders," he said, striding over to the chair. He dropped into it with a cocky flair, spreading his arms like a king awaiting his coronation. "Make it quick," he added, "and make it cheap. Or else," he let the threat hang in the air, unfinished but clear. The other customers, sensing the brewing storm, began to quietly gather their belongings. One by one, they shuffled toward the door, casting nervous glances at Maddox as if silently apologizing for leaving him alone with the wolves. The bell above the door jingled faintly as the last customer slipped out, leaving the shop eerily quiet except for the steady buzz of Maddox's tattoo machine. "You're awfully quiet for someone in your position," the leader said, his tone almost playful. "Aren't you scared?" Maddox didn't answer. He positioned the stencil on the leader's forearm, his hands steady as a surgeon's. "I asked you a question, old man," the leader pressed, his voice hardening. "Are you scared?" Maddox finally looked up, his expression unreadable. "Do you want the tattoo done right," he said evenly, "or do you want me to chat?" The younger biker let out a barking laugh. "He's got a mouth on him," he said, slapping Tank on the arm. "This should be fun." But the leader didn't laugh. He narrowed his eyes at Maddox, studying him like a predator sizing up its prey. "Careful," he said softly. "You don't want to push your luck." Maddox didn't respond. He lowered his gaze back to the leader's arm and began the tattoo. The room fell into a tense silence, broken only by the hum of the tattoo machine. The younger biker wandered the shop, picking up random items and examining them with exaggerated curiosity. He grabbed a framed photo from the counter, a black and white picture of Maddox standing next to a younger man, both of them smiling. "Who's this?" the biker asked, holding up the photo. Maddox glanced at the picture but said nothing. "Your kid?" the biker pressed. "Or is it someone who couldn't handle your crappy tattoos?" "Put it back," Maddox said quietly, his voice calm but firm. The biker raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "What's the matter? Got something to hide?" "I said," Maddox repeated, his tone sharpening ever so slightly, "put it back." The biker held the photo up for a moment longer, as if considering his options, before finally setting it down on the counter. but not before leaving a greasy fingerprint on the glass. Maddox's hand tightened around the tattoo machine. He forced himself to focus, his eyes fixed on the leader's arm as he worked on the intricate design. The leader winced slightly as the needle hit a sensitive spot, but he quickly masked it with a smirk. "Not bad," he admitted. "Maybe you're not as useless as you look." The younger biker snorted. "I still think he's overrated," he muttered, grabbing a bottle of ink from the counter and turning it over in his hands. Maddox didn't react. He had learned long ago how to keep his emotions in check, how to stay calm in the face of provocation. But inside, a storm was brewing. These men weren't just troublemakers. They were predators, and Maddox had spent enough time around people like them to know that they wouldn't leave quietly. As he worked, his mind raced. He thought about the past, the life he had left behind, the choices that had brought him here. He had built this shop as a refuge, a place where he could create beauty instead of destruction. But now, the shadows of his old life were creeping back in, threatening to unravel everything he had worked so hard to build. The leader leaned back in the chair, watching Maddox with a sly grin. "You've got steady hands," he said. "I'll give you that. But let's see if you've got the guts to keep this place running after today." Maddox didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence spoke louder than any words ever could. But deep down, he knew this was just the beginning. The Iron Fang didn't walk into places like this without a reason. And whatever their reason was, Maddox knew it wouldn't end well. The tension in the room was palpable, like the calm before a storm. Maddox could feel the weight of their stares, the unspoken threats hanging in the air. But he didn't flinch. Because Maddox had a secret he had buried deep, a secret that could change everything. And if these bikers pushed him too far, they just might find out what it was. The tattoo machine buzzed steadily, filling the silence with its hypnotic hum. Maddox worked with precision, every line of ink a testament to years of experience. The leader watched him intently, his smirk never quite fading. It wasn't the kind of smile that came from amusement, it was the kind that hinted at a storm brewing beneath the surface. "You've got a steady hand, I'll give you that," the leader said, breaking the silence again. "But steady hands don't mean much when the rest of you is trembling." Maddox didn't take the bait. He kept his focus on the tattoo, the intricate design slowly coming to life on the biker's arm. The younger biker, restless and clearly bored, wandered toward the back of the shop. His eyes landed on a shelf filled with bottles of ink, neatly arranged by color. He picked up a bright red bottle and held it up to the light. "Looks like blood," he muttered, chuckling to himself. He turned to Tank, who was still stationed by the door like an immovable wall. "Hey, Tank, think this guy's ever seen real blood? Or is he too soft for that?" Tank grunted, his face impassive. "Put it down," Maddox said, his voice calm but with an edge that hinted at something deeper. The younger biker turned to him, grinning. "Or what? You gonna throw me out? Let's be real, old man. There's 3 of us, and only one of you." Maddox's eyes flicked toward him for a brief moment before returning to his work. "I said, put it down." The biker's grin widened. He unscrewed the cap of the bottle and tilted it slightly, letting a single drop of red ink fall onto the floor. "Oops," he said mockingly. Maddox's grip on the tattoo machine tightened, but he didn't say a word. The leader watched the exchange with amusement. "You're awfully patient, Maddox. Most people would have snapped by now. What's your secret?" Maddox didn't answer. He finished the last line of the tattoo and leaned back, inspecting his work. "Done," he said simply. The leader looked down at his arm, turning it this way and that to admire the design. It was a detailed depiction of a roaring dragon, its scales shimmering with intricate shading. Despite himself, he seemed impressed. "Not bad," he admitted. "Not bad at all." He stood up and reached into his pocket, pulling out a crumpled wad of cash. He tossed it onto the counter without bothering to count it. That should cover it. Maddox glanced at the money but didn't move to pick it up. The leader noticed and raised an eyebrow. Something wrong? You're short, Maddox said evenly. The room went silent. The younger biker stopped messing with the ink bottles and turned to watch, a gleeful expression on his face. Even Tank uncrossed his arms, his attention now fully on Maddox. The leader's smirk returned, colder this time. Short, huh? He took a step closer, his imposing figure casting a shadow over the counter. Maybe you should consider it a discount for letting us walk out of here without smashing the place up. Maddox met his gaze without flinching. You asked for a tattoo, not a discount. For a moment, no one moved. The tension in the air was suffocating, the kind of tension that made you hold your breath without realizing it. Then the leader laughed, a sharp, humorless sound that echoed through the shop. You've got guts, old man. I'll give you that. He reached into his pocket again and pulled out another wad of cash, slapping it onto the counter. There. Happy now? Maddox didn't respond. He picked up the money and tucked it away in the register, his movements as calm and deliberate as ever. The leader turned to leave, but then paused, looking back over his shoulder. We'll be seeing you around, Maddox. Don't get too comfortable. The younger biker snickered, following him toward the door. Tank trailed behind, his heavy boots thudding against the floor. As the door swung shut behind them, the shop fell silent once more. Maddox exhaled slowly, setting his tools down on the counter. He leaned against the edge of the table, his hands gripping it tightly. He knew this wasn't over. Men like them didn't just walk away. And they had no idea what they were walking into. Maddox stared at the door for a long moment, his mind racing. Memories he had worked so hard to bury began to surface, unbidden and relentless. He thought about the life he had left behind, the choices that had brought him to this small tattoo shop in the heart of the city. He had built this place as a sanctuary, a refuge where he could create instead of destroy. But the bikers had cracked something open, something Maddox wasn't sure he could close again. He walked to the back room, where a heavy metal safe sat tucked away in the corner. He entered the code and opened it, revealing a small collection of items that didn't belong in a tattoo shop. A worn leather jacket, its patches faded but still recognizable. A knife with a handle engraved with intricate designs. And a photograph, creased and worn, showing a younger Maddox standing with a group of men who looked just as rough as the bikers who had walked into his shop today. He picked up the photo and stared at it, his expression unreadable. I left this behind for a reason, he muttered to himself. But the world had a funny way of pulling you back in, no matter how hard you tried to escape. The bikers might have thought they had the upper hand. But Maddox wasn't just an artist. And if they pushed him too far, they were going to find out exactly who they were messing with. The tattoo machine buzzed steadily, its rhythm slicing through the bikers' chatter. Maddox's focus was sharp, each stroke of the needle deliberate and precise. The leader flinched slightly but quickly covered it up with a scowl, his bravado intact. You know, old man, the youngest biker said, pacing back and forth, we don't usually hang around joints like this. Too quiet. Too clean. You should thank us for livening up the place. The leader chuckled. Yeah, maybe we'll send the rest of the boys down here. Make it a regular hangout. Maddox didn't respond, his expression unchanged. But his mind was working, turning over every detail about the bikers, their patches, their mannerisms, their words. He recognized their insignia, a flaming skull encircled by chains. The Black Hounds. Years ago, the name had struck fear into anyone who crossed their path. Maddox had his own reasons for remembering it, reasons he hadn't spoken of in a long time. As the leader shifted in his chair, Maddox adjusted his position, his movements steady. He reached for a small bottle of ink, a peculiar shade of black that shimmered faintly, almost as if it were alive. "What's that stuff?" the youngest biker asked, pausing mid-step. Maddox didn't look up. "Custom blend. For people who want something unique." The leader raised an eyebrow. "You think you're fancy, huh? Just stick to the design, old man." Maddox allowed himself a faint smile. "Trust me. You'll like the result." The tension in the room simmered, the biker's bravado gradually giving way to curiosity. Maddox continued his work in silence, his hands as steady as ever. But there was something in his demeanor now, a quiet intensity that hadn't been there before. While Maddox worked, the youngest biker resumed his aimless exploration of the shop. His eyes landed on a small wooden box tucked away on a shelf. It looked old, its surface worn and scratched, as though